farmers' unrest has taken over Europe are witnessing massive protests. The protesters aim to press governments to ease environmental rules and shield them from rising costs and cheap imports. Farmers have gathered outside the EU Parliament in Brussels as the EU summit has now concluded. They were seen throwing eggs, starting fires near the building and setting off fireworks.
Thousands of tractors have rolled into Brussels, surrounding parts of the European Union's capital and bringing traffic to a halt. Farmers from across Europe say the system meant to support them is now threatening their survival. Highways are blocked, government buildings are surrounded, and supply routes are under pressure. The question now echoing across Europe is simple. What happens if the people who produce the continent's food refuse to cooperate? In January 2024, the European Commission made a quiet decision that lit a fuse across an entire continent. A temporary exemption had been protecting farmers from the most demanding requirements of the EU's Green Deal, rules demanding cuts to fertilizer use, reductions in livestock numbers, and mandatory set-asides of farmland. That exemption was pulled. The full weight of the regulations came back down overnight. Within 72 hours, roads in 6 countries were blocked. Within 1 week, Brussels itself was surrounded. Tractors, hay bales, and diesel smoke filled every major route into the European Parliament. Germany, France, Poland, Spain, Italy, Belgium, Romania, and Greece all mobilized at the same time. No central organization coordinated it. No government called for it. European agriculture had never seen anything like it, and the EU Commission had no prepared answer. The scale of this crisis becomes clear when you look at the numbers. The EU has lost nearly 4 million farms over the past 20 years. These were not empty buildings or idle factories. These were families working land that had been in their names for generations. The average net income of a small to medium European farm has fallen by more than 30% in real terms over the past 15 years. Input costs, fuel, fertilizer, machinery, animal feed rose sharply after the Ukraine war triggered an energy crisis across the continent. The prices farmers received for their products did not rise with them. The Green Deal added new pressure from above. Farmers were told to cut fertilizer use by 20%, reduce livestock numbers, and set aside up to 12% of their land. No financial roadmap was provided, no transition support was guaranteed. In France, protesters dumped tons of manure directly in front of government buildings. In Germany, farmers blockaded fuel depots and threatened to bring the national transport network to a halt. The message was physical, direct, and impossible to misread. But this moment did not come from nowhere. For years, European farmers absorbed the pressure quietly. They filled out the paperwork, they attended the consultations, they trusted that the system would eventually respond to what they were telling it. It did not. The EU's Common Agricultural Policy, the CAP, distributes roughly 1/3 of the entire EU budget. But the top 20% of recipients, the largest landowners and agricultural corporations, collect approximately 80% of all subsidy payments. Small family farmers receive a fraction. At the same time, supermarket chains use their market dominance to push supplier prices below the cost of production. Farmers had no legal leverage to refuse. A liter of milk selling for less than it cost to produce was not an edge case. It was the daily reality for hundreds of thousands of farming families across the continent. The Green Deal did not create that reality, but it accelerated it and did so without giving farmers any meaningful role in writing the rules. The effects of the protests spread quickly and in multiple directions. Supply chains felt the pressure almost immediately. Border crossings were jammed for days. Supermarket distribution centers were surrounded. Transport networks across multiple countries operated under threat. Politically, the timing could not have been more damaging for Brussels. European Parliament elections were weeks away. Right-wing and nationalist parties moved fast, showing up at protest sites, sharing footage of tractors and burning hay bales, and framing the Green Deal not as environmental policy, but as a war by EU elites on working people. That framing was landing in polling data, and this is where the situation becomes more complicated. Eastern European farmers were facing a second crisis running parallel to the first. Cheap agricultural imports from Ukraine, poultry, eggs, sugar, had been granted tariff-free access to European markets as part of EU support for the war effort. Polish, Romanian, and Hungarian farmers watched those imports flood their markets at prices they could not match. Warsaw demanded Brussels act. Brussels moved slowly. The tractors in Poland did not go home. Brussels appeared to respond. Ursula von der Leyen stepped in front of the cameras and announced that the EU was scrapping its most controversial proposal, a plan requiring farmers to cut pesticide use by 50% within a decade. It looked like a concession. It looked like the EU blinking first. But agricultural unions across Europe read the fine print, and what they found told a different story entirely. The land set-aside requirements stayed, the fertilizer reduction targets stayed, the livestock emission cap stayed. Brussels had removed the most visible and politically explosive element of its agenda while leaving the entire underlying framework completely intact. Farmers called it clearly cosmetic surgery on a patient who needed emergency care. But the deeper problem runs further than one policy reversal. Every new compliance requirement the Green Deal adds creates costs. Large agricultural corporations have the capital to absorb those costs. Small family farms do not. The practical effect of the regulation, whatever its environmental intentions, is to accelerate the consolidation of European farming into fewer, larger, corporate-controlled operations. The CAP subsidy structure points in the same direction. 80% of payments flowing to the top 20% of landholders is not an accident of poor design. It is a system that rewards scale and punishes smallness. What the farmer uprising exposed is a structural contradiction the EU cannot solve with a press conference. Its agricultural policy simultaneously claims to protect the small farmer and is built in a way that makes small farming progressively less economically viable. Every year that continues, more families leave the land, more generational knowledge disappears, and Europe's food supply moves further toward dependency on a small number of massive corporations with no loyalty to any land, any community, or any nation. The farmers who came to Brussels understood this. That is why their demands went beyond pausing one regulation. They asked for price guarantees, reciprocal standards on imports, a restructured subsidy system, and a real seat at the table when agricultural policy is written. None of those demands have been meaningfully addressed. The tractors have gone home for now, but nothing that put them on the road has changed. 4 million farms have already been lost. The ones that remain are still operating under the same cost pressures, the same subsidy imbalance, and the same policy framework that triggered this revolt. This was not the end of the story. It was the first chapter. The question Europe now has to answer is not whether its farmers are angry enough to return to Brussels. It is whether its institutions are still capable of genuine reform before the next convoy decides it has nothing left to lose.